Well, greetings, my beloved clients and friends. I've been getting a lot of questions about different elements of Trump's economic policy. So I wanted to do a video about that. And I think it's best to look at his policy in aggregate. And to kind of understand what won him the election really was his, I think, was his economic policy. And the things that were important points among his detractors, I think, was not so much his economic policy, but maybe his environmental policy. For example, one of his platforms of his economic policy, let's say, was drill, baby, drill. And from an economic standpoint, that makes a lot of sense, right? The United States has these natural resources. Why not use them? I mean, we look at Saudi Arabia and they've benefited tremendously economically from having those same type of resources, or Norway or Russia. They have those resources too, and they've used them, and it's been a huge economic benefit to them. So why not, if we have those resources, why not use them to our economic benefit? And the detractors don't really argue from an economic standpoint. They say, well, environmentally it's not that good, right? So they don't say from an economic standpoint it's bad. They say from an environmental standpoint it's bad. So and then other issues that his detractors would have a disagreement with is maybe some social issues, maybe his policy on things like abortion or gay rights and stuff like that, but not economically, right? Socially. And then maybe they don't like his governance. So that's commonly referred to as ESG in business: environmental, social, and governance issues. And maybe his opponents or detractors have issues with his environmental or social or governance issues. But if we just look at the economics, so not have that argument and just look at the economics, I think that's what won him the election. And I think Clinton said it, or it was said during the Clinton president. It's the economy, stupid, right? And I'm not saying that's my point, but I'm saying largely that's how the voters voted. Enough of them to get him elected, right? So what is his economic policy? And I think and that's what he tried to make a point, that you look at my economic policy and you look at the other side's economic policy, and I would submit, Trump saying, being Trump, that mine is better, right? And I think largely people agreed with that, and they voted for him on that point. So what is the economic policy, and what would be the ramifications of it? That's what I want to discuss in this video. And people also ask me about specific points of his economic policy, like, well, but what about the tariffs? And what about deportations? And what about this? Isn't that bad? What about him trying to cut down the size of government? And, maybe government workers are going to lose jobs and stuff. Isn't that bad? And rather than look at each point on its own merits by itself, what if we looked at the policy in aggregate? Okay, and I think if you look at it that way, it'll make a lot more sense. And so let's talk about GDP, gross domestic product, the output of the United States as a whole. And it's been growing at about 2%, 1 to 2%. It's been kind of anemic, the growth of GDP. And if Trump says, I want to make America great again and get back to 3 or 4 or 5% GDP growth, because that would be a rising tide that would lift all boats, would be the theory, right? And you could see a country like China, where in the last 30 to 40 years they've come out of nowhere to become this global superpower because they focused on growing GDP, and they made these changes. They implemented market capitalism, and they were getting like 10% GDP growth initially when they went from a farming society to an industrial society, and they pulled the whole nation basically out of poverty and turned them into a global superpower. And they were getting 7-8% GDP growth for year after year after year, and they were rising out of nowhere. And they have like about 15 cities that are bigger than New York City, that came out of nowhere, man. From 20-30 years ago, those cities were nothing. They were farmland, and now they're bigger than New York, and where New York got to where they were over a period of 400 years. And these cities have gotten to where they were in like 20-30 years because of these changes, right? And now they're a kind of a threat. They're kind of our big competitor, right? In the economy and in politics and in militarily, So, if you look at his policy to just grow GDP in general, in aggregate, 3, 4, 5%, that's his hope. That's his target, right? His economic policy. And so what is GDP? Economists would equate it to aggregate demand, and they would say that aggregate demand has 4 components. That's C plus I plus G plus X sub N. And so when we put that out of economist speak back into English, that's consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. That's the aggregate demand. So if you hang his policies on that and say, well, how would it affect either consumption spending or investment spending or government spending or net exports, and could that increase aggregate demand or GDP and really benefit America? And could he do it without creating runaway inflation or higher inflation? And could he do it without creating massive unemployment, right? Can he do it with strong employment numbers and low inflation numbers? Because any tweak is going to either grow or diminish GDP, but it could also be inflationary or deflationary, and it could also create more employment or less employment, right? So let's look at those things, the policy as an aggregate, and those things one at a point, how they impact those things, to see if it's possible that he could get that nice, healthy, strong GDP growth while keeping inflation low and keeping employment strong, right? So let's break down those 4 elements. Consumption spending is around 65% of total spending. It's the big one. And the American consumer is really good. The American consumer is good at spending. And they've been that way for the last about 80 years since the end of World War II. And but prior to that, when the Great Depression hit at the end of the Roaring 20s, there was a big market crash, and people throughout the 20s had been in more and more people seeing that the market was doing so well and people were making more and more money. More and more people got involved in the stock market, and they did so on a leveraged basis. They were borrowing money to invest in the stock market because they thought it was going straight up and it was an easy way to make money. And for about a decade or so, it was, until it wasn't. And a lot of people got wiped out. People lost millions. People lost their lives, their livelihood, and their families. It was devastating. And as a result, a generation kind of soured against the stock market and investing and borrowing, and they became very, very conservative with their money, right? They didn't want to spend. If they, whatever they had, they were very careful with and very tight with and very frugal with, and they saved it, so that when the government tried to stimulate the economy by sending people money or just giving them jobs, whatever money they got or whatever money they made, they didn't go out and spend it. They saved it. They socked it away. They put it in under the mattress, or they saved it, put it in the bank if they trusted the banks, which they really didn't. They didn't even put it in the bank so that the banks couldn't turn around and lend that money. So any attempt at stimulus by the government was stifled because the people didn't turn around and spend the money, right? It wasn't until the government said, forget it, we're going to spend the money directly. And through World War II, massive government spending on guns and ships and ammo and hiring soldiers and everything they did, that massive stimulus finally got the economy going, and they came back, they won the war, and they started spending money. They had jobs, they bought houses, they started spending money, and the U.S. economy for the last 80 years has been really pretty good. There have been some ups and downs, but it really has been phenomenal. It's become a global superpower, and the U.S. consumer has become a spender, so that the next time the U.S. economy got into a crisis, if the government sent them money, they spent it. Like the example most recently was COVID, right? They shut down the entire economy. Go home and stay home and don't go outside, right? And so what are you going to do with a completely shut down economy? They sent them money. The government sent them money. Guess what the U.S. consumer did? They spent it. They found a way from their couch and their pajamas to spend that money and keep the economy going. And it was really just a blip, right? Because the people spent the money, right? And so that government stimulus worked. And that's been the case for the U.S. consumer. And people get worried, is the U.S. consumer going to pull in their horns? No, they never. Since the Great Depression, they haven't. And that's been a strong point, actually, for the U.S. economy. So that's consumption spending, which is about 65% and is very strong in America, in the good times and the bad. The next one, investment spending, that's business spending. What businesses spend to grow their business on plants and equipment and infrastructure and investing in their business. And that I is about 10%, give or take, of the economy. And then there's G, government spending. The government is a good spender too, right? The conservatives call the Democrats tax and spend liberals because they spend a lot of money. But guess what? The Republicans spend a lot of money too. Whoever's in government, they're pretty good at spending money. So G is about 35% of the economy. And net exports in America, we import more than we export. So that's a negative number. So that's about a minus 5%. So you add them up, that's about 100%. And those aren't exact numbers, but that'll give you an idea of the size of each of those. Consumption spending is the biggest, about 2/3. Government spending is about 1/3. Investment spending less, and exports is actually a negative. Net exports. So what Trump wants to do is grow that in aggregate. He wants to put more money in the consumer's pocket by giving them jobs, by controlling inflation, by having a healthy economy, lowering their taxes. All those things would promote consumption, right? Giving them confidence to spend. consumer confidence is a big part of consumption spending. And then he also definitely wants to promote investment spending by lowering corporate taxes, by decreasing regulation, by keeping interest rates down. All those things would promote investment spending. G, he actually wants to lower G. He wants to make government smaller, lower government expenditures. So that's actually going to bring GDP down if he lays off government workers, right? Makes the size of government smaller. The G would go down. But his hope is that C and I would go up more than G goes down. And on an aggregate basis, GDP would go up, even with G going down. So in isolation, people will say, wouldn't it be bad for laying off all those government workers and the government spending less money? Wouldn't that hurt the economy? Yes, it would, but in isolation. But it could also promote more consumption and more investment. We don't want the government to really crowd out spending, because when the government borrows too much money, there's what's called a crowding out. And the fact is that the government borrows more money than the American public wants to finance, so that the government has to borrow internationally. And that's not such a good long-term strategy, because the Bible says that the borrower is servant to the lender. And if the lender is a foreigner, do we really want to be a servant to that foreigner, So, and the foreigner could at some point say, we don't want to lend to the U.S. anymore. And if they did, then the burden would come on the domestic investor to say, well, you guys got to borrow more. And if they don't want to, then they're going to have to raise rates to entice them to borrow more. So we really don't want the government to be a big borrower. And so if he could lower that would be, I think, would be good. And then he wants tariffs. What about tariffs? Well, tariffs would be restrictive on imports and support exports. So you could see why tariffs is part of his platform. So I just want to give a guideline for how to look at the policy, and then we'll look at each of those points and their own merits and their own ramifications. But think about it in aggregate. The aggregate goal is to grow GDP. GDP has these four components: consumption, investment, government, and net exports. And as a whole, not every single one of them needs to go up for the whole to go up. And if it did, that would tend to bode well for the U.S. economy as a whole. So that's the guideline. Well, I figured it'd be more than one video to go into the detail of each of those, and those other videos will be forthcoming as we dive deeper into Trump's economic policy. But that's an introduction. Okay, have a great day.